I made you pregnant to keep you from leaving, the Mafia boss said. Now you are mine. The people whispered the name of their ruler with both fear and awe, King Valor, the Shadow King. He was a man who wore power like a second skin, ruling not with kindness but with a sharp, cold certainty. Some said his throne was cursed, some said he was cursed himself. And tonight, the streets of the capital hummed with a restless energy, as if the city itself knew something would change. Saris moved through the crowded market alleyways with careful steps. She was a healer, a woman born of gentle hands and quiet words, whose ancestors had once walked the palace halls as royalty themselves. But now, she had no title, no protection beyond the soft cloak wrapped around her shoulders. She had come to the city for work, to help the sick, to tend to the wounded, but something in the air told her she was walking toward destiny rather than duty. Her mind raced as she glanced over her shoulder. The palace loomed ahead, black and jagged, a mountain of stone that seemed to drink the last light of the day. She had been summoned, ordered, really, by the Shadow King himself. His summons had arrived 3 nights ago, sealed with his personal insignia and carried by a hooded messenger who refused to speak a word. The letter had been short: "Come, or do not come, but understand the consequences of refusal may reach beyond your understanding." Now, as Saris approached the great gates, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had heard the stories of Valor's cruelty, how he could bend men and women to his will with a mere glance, how enemies disappeared quietly, leaving only silence behind. She had also heard whispers of the strange, dangerous magic that surrounded him, a power that could twist fate itself. And yet, for all the fear, there was a strange pull, a tug in her chest that made her feet unwilling to turn away. The guards at the gate were statues of black steel, silent and unmoving until she reached them. One stepped forward, his armor reflecting the dim light like liquid shadows. "You have been summoned," he said, his voice low and flat, "by the Shadow King himself. Enter." The gate creaked open, revealing a path of stone that led to the palace proper. Saris walked slowly, trying to steady her heartbeat. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the palace itself was aware of her presence and judging her worth. The halls inside were colder than the night air, and the walls were adorned with tapestries depicting battles and victories long forgotten. Finally, she was brought to a chamber that opened like a cave of obsidian. The room was enormous, but the light was sparse, coming only from a few lanterns that cast flickering shadows across the walls. And there he was. Valor stood at the center, tall, broad-shouldered, draped in a cloak of midnight that seemed to swallow the surrounding darkness. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and his eyes were sharp, piercing, a storm contained within human form. There was a calmness about him that made the air tense, a quiet confidence that demanded attention without a word. "You came," he said finally, his voice deep and smooth, like a river of smoke curling through the chamber. I was summoned," Saris replied, her voice trembling though she tried to hide it. Valor took a step closer, and the shadows around him seemed to shift as if drawn to his presence. "Yes, and you will stay, for a purpose you may not yet understand." Saris shook her head slightly. "I do not belong here. I am not of this court, I am not." "You are here because fate brought you." His tone was gentle now, almost persuasive, yet there was no denying the power behind it. "You carry something inside you that even you do not understand, something that can save my kingdom or destroy it." Her brow furrowed. "I do not know what you mean." Valor's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Of course you do not yet, but you will." He raised his hand slightly, and Saris felt a sudden pull in her chest, as if an invisible thread had wrapped around her very soul. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. What is this?" she whispered, clutching at her cloak. "A bond," Valor said simply, "a living connection between us. It is not your choice and it is not mine. It is fate." Saris's heart raced. She had heard tales of the Shadow King's power, but never like this. Never so personal, so consuming. She tried to step back, but the thread, or whatever it was, held her in place. She realized with a sinking feeling that she could not leave, could not run, could not resist. Vaylor's gaze softened slightly, though the intensity remained. "You do not understand yet, but this is how it must be. You are mine to protect and to guide, and in turn you will protect me. Together we will endure." The words were terrifying, but there was also an undeniable truth in them. Saris could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on her, binding her to a man she barely knew. She felt anger, fear, and an unexpected flicker of curiosity, all at once. "I will not be your prisoner," she said finally, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. Vaylor inclined his head slightly. "No, you are not my prisoner. You are something far more important. And yet understand this, leaving is not an option, not now, not ever." He stepped back, and the thread of power remained, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Saris felt it in her chest, a living presence that seemed to respond to her every heartbeat. She knew instinctively that the bond was growing stronger, that it had claimed a part of her she could not take back. Days passed in the palace like shadows across stone. Saris was not a servant, not a guest, not a prisoner. She was something in between. She tended to the wounded soldiers in the palace, healed the sick courtiers, and learned the rhythms of the Shadow King's court. All the while the bond pulsed within her, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, like the heartbeat of a living being. Vaylor observed her constantly, always from a distance, always just enough to remind her of his presence. He did not touch her, did not command her, at least not openly, but every glance, every measured word carried authority. Saris felt the pull between them like the tide, unavoidable, inexorable, frightening in its intensity. And then, one evening, as the sun bled red behind the mountains, the sigil within her began to stir in a way it never had before. She felt a sudden heat rising from her chest, a sensation like fire and ice mixed together. Panic gripped her, and she ran to the window, pressing her hands against the cold stone. Vaylor appeared behind her without a sound, his cloak brushing the floor. "The sigil awakens," he said softly, almost as if he were reading her thoughts. "I don't understand it," Saris whispered. "I feel strange, like something inside me is moving." "That is because it is alive," Vaylor replied, his voice almost tender. "It responds to emotion, to will, to fear, to hope, and it has chosen you." Saris turned to him, fear and anger mixing in her eyes. "Chosen me? You said this was fate, but I didn't choose this." Vaylor stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "No, you did not. But neither did I, yet it does not matter. You are bound to me, and I am bound to you. The kingdom, our lives, the future, everything depends on it." For a long moment they stood there, the sigil within her pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could feel it reaching out, whispering secrets she could not yet understand. She realized that leaving would no longer be an option. She realized that the Shadow King, for all his fearsome reputation, had bound himself to her as much as she was bound to him. And in that realization, a new fear took hold, one that had nothing to do with the palace or the throne or the war beyond the city walls. A fear that had to do with the strange, impossible truth, that she was not alone, not in her body, not in her heart. And that the man before her, terrifying as he was, could be more than a king. He looked at her then, eyes dark and unreadable. "Do you understand now?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "You will," he said, turning away. "And soon the world will notice. Not all who watch will wish you well." Saris stared out the window, her hands clenched at the stone. The city stretched below her, quiet and unaware, but she knew it would not remain so for long. And she knew, with a chill that ran deeper than the evening air, that her life had changed forever. The sigil pulsed, faintly glowing in the last rays of the sun. It was a living bond, unbroken, unstoppable, and unyielding. And in that pulsing light, Saris realized a single, terrifying truth. She could never leave. And yet somehow she did not entirely wish to. The morning sun rose over the city of Eleanor, painting the towers of the palace with dull gold and shadow. Sarah sat by the window in her small chamber, tracing the sigil that now rested faintly on her wrist. It glowed softly when she moved her hand, like a heartbeat she could feel but not fully understand. Since the binding, the days had passed in a strange rhythm. She healed the sick, walked the palace halls, and tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. But nothing was the same. The palace had become a living thing, dark and heavy, and Vaylor's presence lingered like the scent of smoke in every corridor. Guards and courtiers watched her with cautious respect, their eyes wary of the bond she carried. She was no longer merely a healer. She was a symbol, a living part of the Shadow King's power. Every glance she received reminded her that she was bound to a destiny she did not choose. Vaylor did not speak to her directly every day. Instead, he observed, always close enough for her to feel his attention but distant enough to keep her uncertain. Sarah hated the uncertainty most of all. He was a king of shadows, a man whose power had grown from fear and discipline, yet now she felt the stirrings of something else, something softer and terrifyingly intimate. One afternoon, Sarah found herself in the palace gardens, a place of black stone and withered vines that still held a strange beauty. She traced the edges of the fountains, where water reflected the cloudy sky above. A rustle of fabric announced Vaylor's presence before she could see him. "The sigil is stronger now," he said quietly, stepping onto the path. His voice did not carry anger, nor did it carry warmth. It was a statement like the shifting of stone. Sarah looked at him, her heart tightening. "I can feel it. It moves when I am afraid or angry, or when I hope. I don't know what to do." Vaylor nodded slowly. "It responds to emotion. It grows when we feel deeply, when we act with purpose, and it will guide us if we allow it. But it can also consume us if we are careless." She frowned. "Guide us. It's inside me, not you." He studied her as if measuring the truth of her words. "The bond does not belong to one person. It belongs to both. You cannot ignore it, nor can I. We are tied together whether you accept it or not." Sarah clenched her fists. "Then it is a chain." Vaylor's lips curved in a faint, almost reluctant smile. "Chains are not always weakness. Sometimes they protect. Sometimes they teach us what freedom truly means." Sarah did not respond, but she felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest. The sigil pulsed faintly under her skin, as if echoing his voice. She wanted to run, to leave the palace, to tear herself from the life that had been forced upon her. But every step toward escape only made the sigil flare hotter, reminding her that the bond was stronger than any wall, stronger than any door. In the following days, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the palace. Shadows moved differently when she walked the halls. The air hummed faintly, like electricity before a storm. Even the guards, who had once been stoic and cold, now seemed tense in her presence, as if they sensed the sigil stirring within her. It was during a council meeting that the first real test of the bond came. Lords and ladies gathered in the grand hall, discussing the threats beyond the city walls, enemies who had grown bold in the Shadow King's absence from battle. Vaylor remained silent for most of the meeting, listening, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Sarah. "Your Majesty," one lord said, bowing stiffly, "our scouts report that the northern tribes grow restless. They see weakness in your rule while you remain within these walls." Vaylor's gaze sharpened. "Weakness? No, patience. And yet we cannot wait forever." Sarah felt the sigil warm against her chest, a low pulse that seemed to echo his words. Her eyes flicked to Vaylor, and for the first time she noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the faint shadow of weariness beneath his dark cloak. He was not merely a king. He was a man carrying the weight of his crown, the weight of the bond, and the weight of something he had never admitted even to himself. After the council ended, Sarah wandered the halls, trying to quiet her thoughts. She passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of herself. The sigil glowed faintly beneath her skin, visible only in the dim light. She saw herself, but also something else, something tethered to the Shadow King, to the palace, to a destiny she could not yet understand. Valor appeared behind her, his presence sudden and silent. "You are restless," he observed, his tone careful, almost gentle. "I cannot stop thinking," she admitted, not turning to face him. "About the sigil, about you, about everything." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Do you think I do not feel it as well?" Sarah swallowed hard. "You feel it. Of course, the bond is not one-sided." His gaze softened slightly, the shadow of a smile playing at his lips. "It feels like a storm inside me. Sometimes I want to control it, sometimes I fear it will control me, but mostly I wonder what it will demand of us." For a moment, the weight of his words pressed on her heart. She wanted to speak, to argue, to resist, but she could not. The bond pulsed warmly, like a heartbeat in rhythm with her own. She realized that the Shadow King, terrifying and unyielding as he was, depended on her as much as she depended on him. Days turned into weeks, and Saris grew accustomed to the strange rhythm of palace life. She healed the sick, listened to the worries of the courtiers, and learned the subtle rules of the court. And all the while, the bond pulsed within her, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always reminding her of the connection she could not escape. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky turned a deep violet, Sarah stood in the gardens again. She traced the edges of the fountains, listening to the water trickle, and felt a presence beside her. "The bond grows stronger," Valor said quietly, stepping into the fading light. "It is frightening," she admitted. "Sometimes I feel it pulling me, guiding me, and other times I feel trapped by it." He nodded, eyes dark but unreadable. "That is because it is alive. It responds to us, to our choices, to our hearts. It will test us, tempt us, and challenge us. And yet it can also teach us." Saris looked at him, seeing not the king, not the shadows, but the man beneath it all. She saw the moments of hesitation, the flickers of doubt, the quiet desire for something he could not name. And in that instant she understood something profound. The bond was not merely a chain, it was a mirror. It reflected what they truly were, what they could become, and the truths they refused to see. "And what do you see?" she asked softly. Valor's gaze softened, and he took a step closer, his shadow blending with hers in the dim light. "I see responsibility, fear, hope, and perhaps, if we are brave enough, something like redemption." The word lingered in the air, heavy and impossible. Saris felt the sigil pulse against her chest, as if in agreement, and she realized that the bond was teaching her something too. It was not about possession or power or fear. It was about connection, trust, and the courage to face what they had both tried to deny. "Then we must be careful," she said quietly, "for the bond will not forgive weakness, nor can it be ignored." Valor inclined his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Careful, yes, but also brave. That is the only way forward." The wind stirred in the garden, carrying the scent of distant rain and the faint whisper of something ancient. The sigil pulsed once more, stronger this time, and Saris felt a shiver run down her spine. She realized that the bond had already begun to influence the palace, the city, and perhaps even the fate of the kingdom itself. And then, from the shadows beyond the garden walls, a figure emerged. Not a guard, not a servant, but someone who had been watching for weeks, someone who had noticed the sigil and its strange power. Their presence was silent, but Saris felt it immediately, a ripple of unease that made her heart race. "They know," Valor said softly, his voice tense for the first time. "Our secret is no longer hidden, and not all who watch will wish us well." Saris turned to him, eyes wide. "What do we do?" He looked at her, dark eyes unreadable, then at the distant figure standing at the edge of the garden. "We endure, we protect each other, and we prepare for what is coming." The sigil pulsed brighter, and for the first time, Saris realized that the bond was no longer just a chain. It was a living force, awake and aware, and it would demand everything from them both. As the night fell, the first storm clouds gathered over Eleanor, and the city seemed to hold its breath. The palace stood silent, heavy with shadows, and the bond pulsed like a heartbeat that would not stop. And Saris knew, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that nothing would ever be the same again. Cliffhanger. From the edge of the garden, the Watcher stepped forward, and Saris realized that their presence signaled the arrival of danger she could neither fight nor flee, an enemy who understood the bond, and would stop at nothing to claim its power for themselves. The city of Eleanor slept uneasily beneath the cloak of night. Rain fell in slow, steady sheets, washing the streets and making the black stone of the palace shine like obsidian in the lantern light. Sarah stood at her window, watching the storm, feeling the sigil pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. It had grown stronger in the past weeks, responding not only to her own emotions but also to Vaylor's moods, flickering with warmth when he was near and fading when he was far. Tonight, she felt its pull more than ever. Something was coming. The wind carried whispers she could not understand, but that made her shiver with anticipation and fear. She could feel the palace itself vibrating with tension, as if it knew the danger was near. Vaylor entered the room silently, his cloak wet from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He did not speak at first, merely stood behind her and observed the city through the glass. Saris felt the sigil respond instantly, a quick, sharp pulse that mirrored the tension in the room. "The Watcher has returned," Vaylor said quietly, his voice low, almost a growl. "And they are not alone." Saris turned to him, her eyes wide. "Who are they? What do they want?" "They know about the bond," he replied, moving closer, his presence filling the room. "And they want it. They believe it will give them power over the kingdom over us." Saris swallowed hard. "Us," Vaylor nodded. "You are tied to me, Saris, whether you like it or not. And that bond, it is more than you realize. It is not only protection, it is strength, and strength invites envy." Saris felt a cold shiver run through her. The bond had already changed her life in ways she could not control. Now, it seemed, it had also made her a target. She wanted to protest, to argue that she could handle herself, but even as the words rose in her throat, she knew she would not be able to face what was coming alone. "We cannot wait for them to act," Vaylor continued. "We must strike first." Saris shook her head. "Strike." "I am not a warrior." "You do not need to be," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The sigil will guide us, and I will be with you. Together, we will face this." The bond pulsed warmly under her skin, and Saris felt a strange mixture of fear and comfort. She realized with a slow, sinking clarity that she could not separate herself from Vaylor now. The bond tied them together, their fates entwined, and it demanded action. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and quiet. Vaylor had assembled his closest allies in the council chamber, the shadows of the room deep and heavy. Saris followed him, her steps careful, feeling the sigil respond to the tension in the room. "The northern tribes are gathering," one of the lords said, bowing stiffly. "They will arrive at the city gates within 3 days." Vaylor's eyes narrowed. "And they will find us ready. We do not negotiate with enemies who threaten the kingdom." Saris watched him, noting the tight set of his jaw, the hard line of his shoulders. She knew that behind the mask of the Shadow King there was fear, a fear he rarely allowed to surface. And yet he carried it with him, not as weakness but as vigilance. "Saris," Vaylor said suddenly, turning toward her, "you must come with me. You will not remain behind while the city is threatened." Her heart skipped a beat. I cannot fight. I am not a warrior." "You do not need to be," Vaylor replied, his gaze steady. "The bond will guide you, and I will protect you, but we cannot face this threat alone. Not one of us, not the kingdom, not even the sigil." Saris nodded, a mix of fear and determination settling in her chest. She knew the bond was more than a curse or a chain, it was alive, and it had chosen her to act. She could feel its power coursing through her veins, urging her forward, whispering that strength was not always in the sword, but sometimes in courage and trust. The first encounter came at the city gates, where the northern tribes had gathered under dark banners. Their numbers were great, and their faces hard with determination. But they did not expect Saris, standing beside Valor, glowing faintly with the sigil beneath her skin. Valor moved with precision, issuing commands that directed the palace guards with uncanny skill. But Saris felt the bond within her respond to the fear and aggression surrounding them. A faint light shimmered from her hands, not harmful, but protective, forming barriers and wards that the tribes could not breach. She realized with a sense of awe that the bond was not merely a connection, it was power and it responded to her will. "Focus," Valor said, his voice calm but commanding. "Do not fear it. The bond is ours and it will protect us if you allow it." Saris closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The sigil pulsed beneath her skin, steadying her, giving her courage she had never known. Slowly, she extended her hands, and the light from the sigil spread outward, forming an invisible barrier that held the attackers at bay. The northern tribes recoiled, confused and frightened. They had come to challenge the kingdom, but they had not anticipated the bond or the woman who wielded it. Valor moved beside her, silent and imposing, his presence reinforcing the power of the sigil. Together they were unstoppable. The bond pulsed between them, not as a chain, but as a living force that strengthened them both. After the battle, the city gates were quiet once more. Saris stood alone for a moment, feeling the sigil pulse softly, as if calming after the strain. Valor approached her, his expression unreadable. "You did well," he said quietly. "I knew you could, but there is more to come." Saris looked at him, her chest still heaving. I could feel it. The sigil, it was alive. It responded to me." "Yes," Valor said, his gaze intense. "And it responds to us both. That is why we are bound together. It will demand more from us, and we must be ready." She nodded, feeling both pride and fear. She had faced danger, and yet the bond's full power remained a mystery. She knew it could guide them, protect them, and even fight for them. But she also knew that the bond was not forgiving. It would challenge them, test them, and demand their courage. Days later, in the quiet of the palace, Saris and Valor sat together in the chamber where it had all begun. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the sigil pulsed faintly beneath Saris' skin. "Do you ever fear it?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Valor considered her words carefully. "I fear many things. I fear loss, I fear failure, and yes, I fear the bond. But I also know it is our strength. It is not mine alone, and it is not yours alone. It belongs to both of us." Saris looked down, tracing the faint glow of the sigil with her fingers. "It is strange to feel so connected to someone I barely know, and yet I cannot ignore it." Valor's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, sitting across from her. "You are learning slowly what it means to trust, not only the bond but me, and I am learning to trust you in return." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Saris felt her chest tighten. For the first time she saw the man behind the shadow, the king behind the power. He was not cruel, not heartless. He was burdened, cautious, and deeply human. "And what if the bond demands more than we are ready to give?" she asked quietly. Valor's eyes darkened. "Then we endure, we protect each other, we face it together. That is the only way forward." The storm outside grew stronger, lightning illuminating the city in harsh, fleeting bursts. The sigil pulsed brightly against her skin, and Saris realized that the bond had chosen a path for them, one that would lead to trials, challenges, and dangers they could not yet foresee. "Are we ready?" she whispered. Valor reached out, placing a hand lightly over hers. "We will be together." And in that moment, Saris understood something profound. The bond was not a chain, nor a curse. It was a living force that demanded courage, trust, and connection. And it would not allow them to fail. The first light of dawn broke over Eleanor, painting the sky with soft streaks of violet and gold. The city lay quiet, almost holding its breath, as if sensing the storm to come. Sarah stood on the balcony of her chamber, the sigil glowing faintly beneath her skin, pulsing like a living heartbeat. Its warmth coursed through her, reminding her that she was no longer alone. Vaylor appeared behind her, silent as always, yet the weight of his presence filled the space. His eyes, dark as the night that had ruled the city for so long, held a new depth, an emotion that had been growing slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the weeks they had spent bound together by the sigil. "They are coming," he said quietly, almost to himself. Saris turned to him, her hands tightening on the balcony railing. "I can feel it. The bond, it is restless, like it knows something is about to happen." Vaylor nodded. "Yes, the enemy knows of us, of the bond, and they will try to take it. They will try to destroy us and perhaps the city as well." Saris swallowed hard. Fear bubbled in her chest, but beneath it a spark of courage ignited. She had faced danger before, yet this felt different. The enemy was not only a threat to the kingdom, they were a threat to the bond itself, to the connection that had grown between her and the Shadow King. "Then we face them together," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "We cannot hide, we cannot run." Vaylor looked at her, his expression unreadable, then softened. "No, we face this, together." By midday, the northern tribes had advanced closer to the city walls. Scouts reported that they were not alone. Shadows moved at their edges, creatures whispered of in ancient stories, beings who thrived in darkness, drawn to power and fear alike. The palace was alive with tension. Guards prepared defenses, mages readied their wards, and Saris moved among them, her presence both a reassurance and a symbol of hope. The sigil pulsed faintly beneath her skin, responding to the anxiety of those around her, lending them courage they had not felt before. Vaylor met her in the central hall, his hand brushing against hers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Together, they walked to the highest tower, overlooking the gates and the gathering army beyond. "Do you feel it?" Saris asked softly. Vaylor's gaze swept the horizon. "Yes, the bond is stronger now. It is alive and it knows what is coming, but it will not act alone. It will respond to our choices, our courage, our trust in each other." Saris nodded, feeling the pulse of the sigil strengthen in her chest. It was no longer merely a bond. It was a force, guiding them, protective and demanding of their unity. The battle began as the sun reached its highest point. Thunder rolled in the distance, though the storm had passed, as if the sky itself mirrored the tension below. The northern tribes surged against the city gates, their numbers vast, their faces set with determination and fury. And at their edges, shadows shifted, creatures of darkness ready to strike at any weakness. Sarah stood beside Vaylor, her hands raised slightly, the sigil glowing brighter with each heartbeat. As the first wave of attackers reached the gates, a faint barrier of shimmering light rose from her hands, invisible yet impenetrable. The creatures recoiled, confused by the sudden force that blocked them. "Good," Vaylor said, his voice steady. "Do not hesitate, trust it, trust us." The sigil pulsed stronger, and Saris felt the bond expand beyond her own body, stretching outward, touching Vaylor, the guards, even the walls of the city. It was as if the bond itself had become a living shield, responding to her will, her courage, and her determination to protect those she cared about. Vaylor moved with unmatched precision, directing the palace guards and engaging the enemy with skill and authority. Yet it was the bond that held the line glowing brighter with each strike of magic, each clash of steel. Saris realized then that the sigil was not just a chain binding her to Vaylor. It was a living force of protection, responding to their unity, their courage, and their hearts. Hours passed and the battle raged on. The northern tribes pressed forward, but the bond held strong, forming barriers, deflecting attacks and guiding the defenders with subtle, almost invisible power. Saris could feel the exhaustion in her limbs, the strain of maintaining the connection, yet she refused to falter. The sigil pulsed in rhythm with Vaylor's presence, reminding her that she was not alone. "You are doing well," Vaylor said quietly, appearing beside her, his hand brushing hers in fleeting contact. "Do not doubt yourself. The bond will follow your will, but it listens to courage more than fear." Saris nodded, drawing strength from his words. She had feared the bond at first, thought it a chain, a curse. But now she understood its true nature. It was alive, yes, but it thrived on trust, on connection, and on the bravery of those it bound together. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the creatures of shadow pressed forward, their forms larger and darker than anything Saris had faced before. They moved with a speed and intelligence that made the defenders falter. The sigil pulsed frantically in her chest, a warning and a call to action. "We must act together," Vaylor said, his voice urgent. "Focus on me, focus on us." Saris took a deep breath, extending her hands. The sigil flared with brilliant light, connecting to Vaylor's presence, surrounding both of them and the defenders in a protective sphere. The creatures shrieked and recoiled, their dark forms dissolving into shadows that could not withstand the power of unity. The battle ended as night fell. The northern tribes had retreated, defeated not by brute force alone, but by the bond that Saris and Vaylor shared. Guards cheered, though tired and wounded, and the city itself seemed to exhale, releasing a tension it had held for too long. Saris sank to her knees, exhausted, the sigil dimming to a gentle glow. Vaylor knelt beside her, his dark eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "Not because of me, not because of the crown, but because of your courage, your heart, and the bond that chose us both." Saris looked up at him, seeing not the Shadow King, but the man beneath, the man who had been burdened by fear, by loneliness, and by power he did not understand how to wield without hurting those he loved. I could not have done it without you," she whispered. Vaylor shook his head gently. "And I could not have done it without you. The bond is not one-sided, Saris. It demands trust, courage, and connection from both of us. You have given it that and so much more." The sigil pulsed softly between them, warm and alive. It was no longer a chain, nor a burden, nor a curse. It was a force of life, a guardian and a mirror of the hearts it bound together. In the days that followed, the bond continued to grow stronger. The city began to heal, its people inspired by the courage of the woman and the king who had faced impossible odds together. Saris and Vaylor spent long hours in conversation, learning about each other not as ruler and subject, but as equals bound by trust, shared struggle, and a connection deeper than either had anticipated. Vaylor learned to listen, to temper his commands with patience and understanding. Saris learned to trust not only the bond, but the man beside her, seeing in him a capacity for compassion and growth that had been hidden beneath years of fear and solitude. The sigil pulsed warmly, a constant reminder of their unity, and they understood that it would not fade. It was a living testament to their courage, their trust, and the choices they had made together. "The bond has changed us," Saris said one evening, looking out over the city from the palace tower. "It has made me stronger, braver, and I think it has changed you too." Vaylor smiled faintly, dark eyes softening. "It has. It demanded the truth of us both. And in that truth we found more than power. We found each other." The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings. Saris felt the sigil pulse warmly beneath her skin, steady and alive, and she knew that the future, uncertain as it was, held promise. Not just for the city or the kingdom, but for them. "We will face whatever comes next," Vaylor said quietly, placing a hand over hers. "Together," Saris nodded, feeling the bond pulse like a heartbeat against her own. "Together," she agreed. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, the sigil glowed faintly, a living witness to the courage, love, and unity that had been born of light and shadow. The city slept peacefully for the first time in decades, the palace heavy with quiet triumph. And far beyond the walls, the shadows that had once threatened them stirred, but they no longer dared to approach. For the bond was awake, alive, and unbreakable, and so were the hearts it had bound together.